Sport tries to be apolitical, to not take sides, but sometimes events force it to do so. Violence in Gaza and Israel has motivated several high-profile footballers to speak out. So why are some being suspended while others are not? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, some footballers in Europe who've written messages supporting Palestinians don't know when or if they'll be allowed back on the pitch. But pro-Israel support has so far not been sanctioned. So is there a double standard at play here?
The escalations in the recent weeks is unbearable to witness. All lives are sacred and must be protected. The massacres need to stop. Families are being torn apart.
One of the biggest names in football, drawing international attention, though this time not for his athletic skills.
I'm calling in the world leaders to come together to prevent the further slaughter of innocent souls. Humanity must prevail.
The Egyptian international had drawn criticism for staying silent for so long before this message was posted. But others who've shown support for Gaza are benched. Anwar El Ghazi was suspended by his German club Mainz after posting a pro-Palestinian message on social media that the club said was unacceptable. It has since been deleted. In France, Nice defender and Algeria international Youssef Attal was suspended after he posted on social media. He later apologized, saying he condemns all forms of violence wherever they are in the world, and he stands with the victims. Attal's alleged anti-Semitic post has been referred to the league's ethics committee, while French prosecutors are investigating charges of, quote, defending terrorism. French courts could be busy. Former international footballer Karim Benzema is threatening to sue the Interior Minister for defamation after the politician accused the player of having links to an extremist political movement. Benzema tweeted his prayers for the victims, again, of unjust bombardments which spare neither woman nor child. The minister responded that Benzema is well known for his links with the Muslim Brotherhood. On the flip side, Tottenham forward Manor Solomon, and the only Israeli player in the Premier League, is posting often about the war, including this after the Switzerland-Israel match was called off. In contrast to other clubs, Tottenham is said to be offering support at this difficult time. And Arsenal fullback Alexander Zinchenko posted that he stands with Israel on Instagram. The Ukrainian has since made his account private due to the backlash, but the club so far hasn't commented. Football and politics have a long history of colliding. In 1935, the England squad gave the Nazi salute before the match against Germany, the Iranian team refusing to sing the national anthem at the Qatar World Cup, and players wearing yellow and blue armbands for Ukraine. So why do some actions draw applause while others end careers?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Paris is Yasser Louati, French political commentator and human rights advocate. In Leeds, in England, Arti Ratna, Associate Professor of Social Science at the Northumbria University. And in Sheffield in the UK is Usman Akhtar, freelance sports journalist. Welcome to Roundtable to all of you. Yasser, I'll come to you first. Should footballers speak out and have a moral voice on issues, or should they just keep playing soccer?
Well, football players are like the rest of us. They are human beings, and human beings are political beings. And to keep them or ban them from speaking or voicing their opinions is actually depriving them of part of their humanity. So, of course, they have not only the right to speak up, but also we shouldn't forget that millions of people look up to them, and they can play sometimes very influential roles into steering decision-making when it comes to social justice and what we're witnessing right now in Palestine and influence public opinion.
Arti, what's your view?
Well, sport's always been a political arena, and historically athletes have always used this platform to comment on the social world around them and to call out injustices and talk about oppression of different communities. And, you know, when we look at history, we see people like Muhammad Ali, who spoke about his opposition to US invasion of Vietnam. And he was slated at the time when Colin Kaepernick, went down on one knee to protest police violence against Black communities, he was slated by the US government. But, history tells a story, and these political actors are now revered now. But if they didn't take that stance and use their position to say something political and something important, injustices would continue. So I don't think it's just because they're humans and they're speaking from a place of humanitarian justice. It's because they're political actors and we should see them as such.
Usman, what do you say? I mean, a lot of people will argue these guys and girls are very highly paid professionals and they should just stick to sport. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I'd have to agree with the panelists that have spoken before me. I think a lot of sports athletes have a voice, and obviously they have the fan base to sort of reverberate and obviously get their voice out there. You've seen with the Mohamed Salah video, of course, a lot of people are questioning the validity of that and the authenticity of that video, but nonetheless, he's raised a very important discussion within the Middle East at the moment, and I think it's extremely important, as we've already alluded to with the Muhammad Ali example, the most famous activist, sports activist in the history of sports. These people have the power to make change, and I think it's important that they use that power where they feel is necessary. So for Salah's example, he's raised the question, and obviously a lot of people have now watched that video, and a lot of people are starting to pay interest to what's happening in the Middle East, and people are starting to ask the important questions. And I think it's integral that they don't shy away from their responsibilities and the power that they do possess to make change in the world, as Muhammad Ali did previously.
Yasser, you're in France. Let's look at what's been happening in your country in recent years. Is it fair to say there is a level of hostility against prominent Muslims who speak out, particularly in the world of sport, that they almost get questioned about their Frenchness if they raise their voices too loud?
I mean, I'm part of a generation that saw the first French Black athletes, win major titles like Yannick Noah and Roland Garros in the late 1980s. And there is this famous quote that we have in France is, when they win, they are French. When they lose, they are from Cameroon, Algeria, whatever. And in France, there is a particular and very vicious policing of Muslim players, especially when they start voicing their opinions. As you mentioned in your first question, they are actually expected to just entertain the country and keep their opinions for themselves, especially if these opinions go against the dominant narrative and, if may I say, the narrative being pushed by the government. And the rest of the world is right to question how France treats these players when we see, for example, a person as prominent as Karim Benzema being crucified in public space with members of parliament seeking his citizenship to be stripped. So yes, there is constant policing of these players, and that is why we, as they speak up and as a new generation of players is ever more politicized and does not want to shy away from taking part in the debate. Mbappe, for example, is one of them. We see the response not being it is their right, but they should remain quiet, and if they don't, we are going to punish them.
Artie, do you think it's a case that there's commercial pressure here at the highest level on clubs, where companies and big business are sponsoring and putting millions into sport, and they would rather Muslim players just kept quiet?
Yeah, of course they would. The commercial gains of being apolitical for many sports communities, is quite important to their brand and image. But unfortunately, commercial entities can't always control players. And I feel like since 9/11, something has happened across the world, and particularly in Western countries where, the Islamophobia is rife, and you can't say anything or, challenge the Islamophobia without being seen to be the problem in the first place for calling out that issue. And so when you see players talking to Islamophobia, talking about their support of Palestine, you can see this sort of vitriol coming that, they shouldn't be speaking. But of course they should be speaking, because they have to speak.
Usman,
because if we don't speak, the Islamophobia will just continue.
Usman, I want to ask you, do you feel that clubs exert pressure then over their players? They see them as their employees, they're on a contract. Will a club be constantly monitoring players' use of social media, especially at a time of such tension like now?
Yeah, I mean, I think Arsenal Football Club are a great example of not dealing with the situation, in my personal opinion, the correct manner. There was a tweet that Mohamed El Neni, who's an Egyptian footballer who does currently play for Arsenal, in 2021, where essentially he posted about Pro-Palestine, basically put his support out there, and the football club was extremely quick to condemn his thoughts. They put out a statement essentially alluding to the fact that they champion inclusivity and obviously they don't discriminate against obviously other nations and so forth, which is completely fine and they're well within their right. But then on the flip side, fast forward to the present day, Zinchenko put out a post a couple of weeks ago supporting Israel, and Arsenal were absolutely silent. There's no ramifications, no reprimanding of Zinchenko, no talking to Zinchenko. And I think for me, that's extremely dangerous when quite clearly they're condemned El Neni for his stance on pro-Palestine, and on the flip side, when Zinchenko was posting on Instagram about pro-Israel, they completely ignored it. They didn't put a statement out. And that actually, if you actually look at the El Neni statement as well, they do reference sponsorships, and that was one of the reasons why Arsenal was so quick to condemn El Neni's thoughts. And on the flip side, with Zinchenko, of course, talking about pro-Israel doesn't affect their sponsorship and doesn't affect the club's bottom line. If you go back into the history again for Arsenal Football Club, Turkish player Mesut Ozil famously made his comments against China, and Arsenal essentially did the exact same thing that they did with El Neni. When it affects their sponsorships or their money or their income coming to the club, they essentially isolated themselves from those statements and made it extremely clear that Arsenal Football Club do not affiliate or associate with those players, and those statements are directly from the opinions of those players. And again, as I mentioned, with Zinchenko for Ukraine and now for Israel, when he's made his statements, the club haven't actually reprimanded or condemned him. And if anything, they've somewhat supported him subconsciously, because they've not actually come out and released a statement regarding his opinion on those political stances. So for me personally, it is an issue, but I do feel a lot of it is down to the fact that the clubs are losing financial backing from sponsorships, hence they come out so vocally on some people and not so much on other people.
Well, it's an interesting point to raise. Let's talk about double standards now. Yasser, in the Premier League, Tottenham Hotspur, a huge club in London, they have an Israeli international, Manor Solomon. He served in the Israeli Defense Forces. He has been prominent on social media in support of Israel over the last couple of weeks. No criticism from anyone. Do you detect double standards when it comes to some players and their backgrounds?
Well, if the current bombings and the genocide, the ongoing genocide in Gaza revealed something about the West, it is its total moral bankruptcy and despicable double standards. I forgot to mention earlier that while players are asked to not be political when it comes to issues, as mentioned before me, of Islamophobia, racism, police brutality, and the ongoing Palestinian issue, we forget that institutions have themselves heavily politicized the sports. When it came to the Ukraine, we have seen an outpouring of support with flags in and on the field, outside the field. The visual displays, etc., were oftentimes updated to include support for the Ukraine. Russian players were banned from playing, etc., and no one questioned this, politicization of sports. As for the double standards and the case at point you just mentioned, well, we have to understand that our policymakers and politicians and the government itself, they view sports as an extension of their policies, and that the sport should play, on their side, not against them. And as our governments in the West, I can speak of France and the grotesque support Macron is showing to the Israeli far-right government, we see that this continues into sports by keeping those with a pro-Palestine view from speaking up publicly.
Artie, I want to talk about the Wembley Arch in London. The UK government recently put a lot of pressure on the English Football Association to light that arch up ahead of an England game against Australia in the colours of the Israeli flag, and the Football Association said no. What was your reading of that? Should we be lighting prominent buildings and stadia up in support of countries?
To be honest, I don't really know whether they should have done it or not, but I do know that, you can't hide that from, North London, for example. There is anti-Semitism that's rife amongst fan communities, and that it's passed off as banter. And so a lot of members of the Jewish community do feel hurt by that banter, especially when they're supporting, football clubs that are very dear to them. So I know for those communities, maybe having some sort of symbol or recognition of what is going on, would have been important. But then flip the other side, I think there needs to be recognition of what's going on for Palestinians too, because they have something in common, the Palestinians and the Israelis. They're both hurting by what's happening. And I feel like some of the football clubs, some of them have come down on players, and some of them have decided to ask their teams and fans to be apolitical. So I know Celtic Football Club fans were told by the governing body that they shouldn't actually be supporting Palestine. But the fans have called out Celtic Football Club for their double standards. And the reason that they've done that is because when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were loads of banners and symbols and signs and memorabilia that were around the ground that the institution endorsed to support Ukrainians. So why can't you also support Palestinians then? But I've got a bit more of a cynical view as well. I feel like in some of the teams around North London, but in other parts of the country too, we saw Liverpool, for example, their fans came out in support of Palestine, showing that oppression that's happening there is unacceptable. And I feel like some of the football clubs have been silent, and perhaps their silence is also about the fact that we have a lot of Arab money in the Premier League now, and they don't want to annoy those sponsors or stop that flow of money coming in to the clubs, because the clubs need that income. And so there's been a bit of an inconsistent approach. I feel like some clubs have come out and supported, others haven't.
I want to bring Yasser back in. You're shaking your head, Yasser. There is a lot of Arab money in the Premier League. Do you feel that is a factor for some clubs?
Well, I have to disagree on that, because the Arab money pouring into British clubs is not Arab money that supports Palestine. It comes from dictatorships that actually tried to bury the Palestinian issue and actually further normalize relations with Israel. We can talk about Saudi Arabia, we can talk about the UAE, just to mention a few. So I don't think this comes into play when it comes to the position of football clubs. As, if I can just add a small comment before not to take my predecessor's speaking time, lighting, or showing the Israeli flag on a British building is actually feeding anti-Semitism in the fact that it associates all Jews with what Israel is committing. And this is how many Jews who do not condone what Israel is doing feel repulsed by this constant association between being Jewish and being Israeli. Israel represents a nationalist project. It does not necessarily represent all Jews. And if the British government or the French government want to show support towards the local Jewish communities who have the right indeed to fear anti-Semitism, it is not by associating them with an apartheid state.
Usman, I want to ask you how the players who have tweeted support of Palestine and been prominent on social media will be feeling. I mean, just looking at the list, Anwar El Ghazi got suspended from his club. Youssef Attal of Nice is being investigated by the French authorities, and Karim Benzema is facing calls to have his French citizenship removed. How do you think these players will be feeling now?
I mean, obviously, I just want to start with the El Ghazi one. For me, I think that's the clearest example of double standards for me personally. As you kind of mentioned there, obviously Mainz has come very hard on the player, and obviously made it extremely apparent that they do not stand for his views, and obviously he has had somewhat ramifications off the back of that. On the flip side, when the Ukrainian situation was happening, when they were being invaded by Russia, Mainz were extremely supportive of the situation. They actually provided aid for those people from Ukraine. They provided kits, and they were extremely supportive in the manner in which they led up to that, and obviously the way they conducted themselves as a football club. And I feel like El Ghazi will be looking at that and feeling, why is it different for Palestine and why is it different for Ukraine? And I think that's where a lot of these players, obviously you mentioned Karim Benzema as well, there's a quite clear double standards within the Western media. When players are coming out and speaking about Ukraine, even the clubs are coming out and speaking about Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. But as soon as it's Palestine or if it's Muslims' lives, I don't feel like the Muslims' lives have as much weight as those lives from the Western world. And I think that's where, for me personally, the issue lies.
Yasser, how divisive is this issue in France? Because for decades we've seen an extraordinary contribution made to French national teams by young French Arabs, guys of French Northern African descent, heroes to many, many millions of young people who follow football and rugby and other sports in France. How divisive an issue is this in French public opinion?
Well, we actually have a major divide between French public opinion and what the government and the media, the mainstream media, are currently doing. To give you an example, a very popular show on the Channel 8 lost 600,000 viewers in a single day because of the ultra pro-Israeli positions of the once very popular host. At the same time, the government is not made of total idiots. They know the influence these players have, especially that these players, they mostly come, if not all of them, most of them, to be more fair, come from the banlieue, and they come from these modest income families. So millions of youngsters do identify with them. So the government is deeply afraid of the potential influence they might have, especially when we have seen a systemic attempt to criminalize the very idea that that Palestinians not only have the right to exist, but also the right to resist colonization and oppression. And now what we are seeing, especially in light of the attempt to ban all pro-Palestinian demonstrations and seeing tens of thousands of people marching regardless in support of Palestinians' rights, it shows that there is a profound dichotomy between the popular feeling, especially when it comes to modest and low income families, blue-collar voters, and the elite and the higher-ups voting for Emmanuel Macron. Right now, we do not see which one is going to influence the other, because Emmanuel Macron is pushing a specific ultra pro-Israeli rhetoric, while we see at the base, this is not necessarily in accordance, and people do not necessarily agree. And this is where these football stars, they can actually tip the balance and push maybe government officials to not actually continue on this road, but can try to find some kind of a middle ground. I'm not very optimistic. I'm not saying they are going to push Macron to change his ideology and all of a sudden become pro-human rights. I'm just saying that we see a split, and even Le Monde wrote about that. As it's actually a tale of two Frances, one that supports Israel among the higher-ups and one that supports Palestine among the working class.
Artie, my final question is to you. Have we reached a stage now where social media, at times like these, are just a huge pitfall for professional sports people?
I think social media has a role in that it's enabled people to use that medium to speak out against the atrocities against civilians in Gaza and the children. And I think that has been really important, especially when they don't have a voice in other spaces. I just feel like what's going on is just atrocious. And, it reminds me, after 9/11, in my research, Muslim girls that were playing football at a local park had their headscarves ripped off and told to go home and that they shouldn't be playing football. And I'm so worried that now, with what's going on in Gaza and the, treatment of Palestinians as, the human animals, the label that was used by the Israeli Defense Force minister, it's going to have reverberations everywhere. And I'm worried that, we have to use social media to continue to speak about these atrocities, because, I was at a rally on Saturday, And, you know, there were so many drones. The surveillance of Muslim communities in and through the spaces of the UK has already started. And, you know, one guy was videoed shouting, "This is Leeds, this is ours," suggesting that British-born citizens like me, this space wasn't ours. And so the impact of the division and the rampant Islamophobia, I'm really worried. Like, my daughter wants to play football. She's just joined a football team. She looks like me. Her father's a white Englishman. But because she looks brown, is she going to get hate? So I really worry that the knock-on effect of everything that's going on is going to really accelerate Islamophobic hate crime. And maybe social media in this moment is important to call it out, because sometimes in other spaces of our lives, at home, at work, it's actually difficult to have that conversation. So maybe we should have it through social media.
Arti, Usman and Yasser, thank you all so much for joining me. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.